Hello everyone, and welcome back to another GIS Mathematics lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to talk about three additional trig functions. So we talked about sine, cosine, and tangent, and those are the three most commonly used. But there are three other, three other trig functions. Right, and that kind of makes sense because we've defined these trigonometric functions as a relationship between an angle and the lengths, right? So we had opposite over adjacent, opposite over hypotenuse, and adjacent over hypotenuse. But there are certainly other combinations that we could have, right? Those three are not an exhaustive list of the combinations that we could get by combining different side lengths. So we have three other trig functions that are less widely used, but still important to know. And they involve the other relationships, right? The other relationships that we can build. So the first one is going to be called secant. It's going to be called secant, or sometimes you'll see it S-E-C for secant. Right? And again, secant is the hypotenuse over the adjacent. Right? Secant is the hypotenuse over the adjacent. And so what I want to do really quickly is just remind ourselves of Sohcahtoa, because this is going to be helpful in a second. So we have sine is equal to opposite over hypotenuse. Right? Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. And then tangent is opposite over adjacent, right? Again, this is that Sohcahtoa. And the reason that I want to bring these up is because we're going to eventually go back to these three trig functions that we're going to create over here, and we're going to see a direct relationship between these three and these three. So the first one we have is called secant, which is the hypotenuse over the adjacent. The next one we have is called the cosecant. It's called the cosecant. So the cosecant is going to be hypotenuse over opposite. Right, it's going to be hypotenuse over opposite. And then finally, we have the cotangent, which is going to be adjacent over opposite. Now I want to just take a second. I want to let these three definitions sort of sink in. And then I want to look and see how these compare with our original three trig functions that we've defined in the previous video. And what you might notice here is that secant is hypotenuse over adjacent, whereas cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So you might be correctly thinking that the secant is really just the inverse of cosine. And when I say inverse, I mean 1 over cosine. Right? Because 1 over cosine means you flip cosine, which would make this hypotenuse over adjacent, which is the definition of the secant. So hopefully that makes sense. And this works both ways, right? the cosine is also equal to 1 over the secant, right? This inversion works both ways. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, just to be clear and reiterate here, secant, hypotenuse over adjacent, that is the same thing that you would get if you flipped cosine, which is signified by this inversion of 1 over that relates secant to cosine. So what about cosecant? Hypotenuse over opposite. Well, again, if we look over here, we see that sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So we get that same sort of relationship, right? Whereas secant was 1 over cosine, cosecant is 1 over sine. And similarly, sine is the same as 1 over cosecant. I'm hoping this makes sense. I'm hoping this sinks in. And then finally, cotangent, adjacent over opposite, is the inverse of tangent, which would make sense because you see tangent in both names here. So this is going to be 1 over tan, whereas the tangent is going to be 1 over cotangent. And this is COT. Right? So hopefully this makes sense. Again, I did this in a separate video because I didn't want to throw all 6 definitions at once, but rather I wanted to make sure you understood these 3, which have a nice Sohcahtoa application here, before throwing on these 3, which just, quite frankly, don't have as nice of a mnemonic to remember them. But if you can remember that they're directly related to Sohcahtoa, then that can help you sort of go back and forth here. So in the next video, what I want to do is I want to go through examples of calculating secant, cosecant, and cotangent. So if any of this was confusing, I encourage you to pause the video, go back, rewatch the part you're confused about, and as always, please reach out. Thank you.